Pizza orders at the end of the day. If you've ever worked the late shift at a delivery restaurant, then you're probably familiar with occasionally receiving a last-minute order just before closing. That day, a man placed an order for a pizza. After entering the location into the GPS, I realized that the address was far and remote. I tried to mention the inconvenience of delivering it because it was quite far, but the guy on the phone just ignored me. As I entered the address into the GPS on my phone, I realized how remote it was, and I started regretting not hanging up when I had the chance. As I drove, the winding, unfamiliar roads led me deeper into the countryside, past an old abandoned blockbuster. I recalled my mother's warning never to go beyond that place, but I never knew why. Memories of missing children and locked doors from years ago flooded back, leaving me uneasy. The dirt roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Finally, I arrived at the location, a rundown, abandoned house at the end of a muddy road. I felt a chill as I wondered if I had the right address, but the GPS confirmed that I had arrived. Leaving the pizza in the car, I approached the house to see if anyone was home. A note was taped to the door with instructions to deliver the pizza to a vehicle near the house. This struck me as odd. Why hadn't the customer mentioned this over the phone? And who asks for a pizza to be delivered to a vehicle? I was confused. Despite growing anxiety, I decided to follow the instructions since I had come this far. As I rounded the corner of the house, I was startled to see an old camper van parked with its back doors wide open. I slowly approached, hardly daring to breathe. I froze as I realized the figure was dragging something heavy, a rolled-up carpet, stained dark. The man finally moved, stepping forward into the dim light. His face remained hidden in the shadows by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel the cold and mysterious aura emanating from him. He extended a gloved hand toward me, but instead of reaching for the pizzas, he handed me an old, weathered envelope. I hesitated before taking it, sensing something unsettling. His voice was low and ominous as he told me to take the envelope to the house on the hill, a place I knew was infamous in local lore, said to be cursed. Before I could refuse, the man turned and walked back into the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness. I was left alone in the cold night, holding the envelope. I quickly turned and rushed back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine and get away. I didn't dare open the envelope, fearing what might be inside. Instead, I threw it onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove off. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, praying no one was following me. Then suddenly, that vehicle began chasing me, with the faint sound of the radio echoing behind. In a moment of desperation, I decided to floor the gas pedal and head back to the old blockbuster building, the only nearby place where I might find some cover. I pulled off the road and parked behind the building, killing the engine. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I waited until the music faded before I dared to breathe again. As I sat in the darkness, my phone finally died, plunging me into complete isolation. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was him, slowly approaching with that mysterious wide-brimmed hat. Panic began to overtake me. I fumbled to start the car, my hands trembling with fear. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car, his hands slamming against the window. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away from there. I drove straight to the police station. When I arrived, I frantically explained what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. They told me that the house where I delivered the order had been abandoned for years and that the area was known for strange occurrences, but I knew what I had seen. Several weeks later, as I tried to move on with my life, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the same old envelope, and this time there was something inside, a small handwritten note that simply read, We will meet again. The darkness from the Myers house. I used to work for DoorDash a few years ago, wandering through the maze of New York City at midnight to earn a few extra bucks. Tonight was no different, but it turned out to be my last delivery, a job that haunted me long after I left. GPS led me to an unfamiliar part of the city, dark and alien. My destination was an old, rundown fast food joint I'd never seen before. A man came out of the kitchen holding a package. It was red, like rotting meat, and I seriously doubted the hygiene and quality of their food. Handing me the package, the man said it was to be delivered to a place called the Myers house. The old man looked at me with hollow eyes and said to deliver it just before midnight, not to knock, just to leave it at the door. Confused, I asked if I should notify the customer. The man's face darkened. "You don't want to disturb Mrs. Myers. Trust me, it's for your own good and safety." His words lingered as I left. Something felt very wrong about this delivery, and I couldn't help but dwell on the strangeness of it all. In the drizzling rain, GPS led me down an abandoned road, miles away from any familiar part of the city. Soon, a shape emerged in the mist, the Myers house. The building loomed before me, old and decrepit, with boarded-up windows. I checked the address again. It matched. A dim light flickered on the porch, but there was no doorbell. I hesitated, then knocked on the heavy old door. The sound echoed in the silence, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder, and the door creaked open just enough to reveal a face. A pale woman appeared in the gap. She whispered, "Didn't he tell you not to knock?" I stammered an apology, then made an excuse. It's so dark, and I didn't want to leave the food outside." She gave a strange smile, her bony fingers brushing against mine as she took the package. They were icy cold, the chill seeping into my bones. At that moment, a loud clap of thunder boomed outside, and rain began pouring down. I groaned at the thought of heading back out into the storm. She looked at me. "You can wait here. Perhaps a cup of tea while you warm yourself?" Exhausted and soaked, it being my last shift, I figured it wouldn't hurt. So, I stepped inside. I followed her inside, surprised by the stark contrast to the exterior. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow across the luxurious living room. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor and offered me tea. I sat down, feeling a bit uneasy. She began offering me dessert, but I declined. Then her expression shifted. Eleanor's smile grew dark and menacing. Suddenly, something gleamed, a butcher knife in her hand. I froze, realizing the hunger burning in Eleanor's eyes. Panic overtook me. My head spun as I tried to stand, but my legs felt leaden, my movements sluggish. I could barely lift my arms. I forced myself to stand, reaching for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a brass candlestick. As Eleanor lunged, staggering, I swung with all the strength I had left. The candlestick connected with a sickening crack, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her bony fingers clawed at the carpet, dragging her broken body toward me, the hunger in her eyes burning brighter. Taking advantage of the brief respite, I staggered toward the front door, fumbling for the handle. With desperate strength, I yanked the door open. I didn't look back as I ran into the storm. I kept running until I saw and flagged down a passing car, collapsing onto the wet sidewalk. The last thing I saw was a stranger's worried face as I blacked out. I woke up in a hospital room and was told I had been drugged with sedatives. Even more shocking was that the restaurant where I had picked up Eleanor's order had vanished. It didn't exist on GPS. I can't help but think there are still hidden restaurants scattered across the city, secretly catering to the midnight cravings of cannibals I'll never understand. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is quite fitting for someone who enjoys solitude. Just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we divide the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different, as though something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and kept cleaning. I put on headphones, playing music low enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had placed earlier had fallen over. I sighed and stepped forward to pick it up, but that's when I saw them. Small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints, which led to the staircase heading up to the second floor. I stopped, trying to listen for any sound. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flicker of motion at the end of the hallway. I rushed to the end of the hallway, but no one was there. At that moment, I heard faint laughter, the giggling of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending a chill down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket had been tipped over, spilling water into a large puddle. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I tried to figure out what was happening. Were there students still in the building? Had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was joking with her. She looked at me, completely puzzled, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her workspace and went back to finish my shift. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It felt like the entire building had turned into a horror movie set. I knew where the electrical room was, so I decided to head there. But before I could reach it, I heard a scream, my coworker's scream, echoing through the school, filled with terror. I ran toward the electrical room, fear welling up inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. When I pushed the door open, I expected to see my coworker inside. Instead, there was a figure standing in the dark. I couldn't tell who it was, but something about it felt off. The figure moved closer. Before I could pull out my phone, it lunged forward and slammed the door shut in my face. Panicked, the first ran away. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was no response. The only sound was faint laughter, echoing again through the empty hallway. The whispers made me freeze. I turned quickly, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I moved slowly and cautiously. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I headed up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. When I reached the hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, had returned. I stared at the small, damp prints, which seemed to be heading toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. That's when I saw the blackboard. Scrawled in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." Had someone come in here? But I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The handle twisted violently, shaking as though someone, or something, was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The pounding on the door stopped. I slowly crept toward it and pressed my ear against it. But there was nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as possible. I cracked the door open slightly and peered into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, scanning for any signs of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. As I walked down, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly visible in the red light. As I got closer, I saw a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a tattered school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The child didn't respond. I took another step forward, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. Then the child turned around, a horrifying mask, pale and soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, toothy grin aimed at me. The child let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the stairwell, a shrill, piercing sound that felt like it was ripping through my skull. I staggered backward, dropping the mop. I ran as fast as I could down the hallway. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed endlessly long in a horrifying way. I burst through the door into the gym. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps stopped. The door remained shut. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard it, a basketball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the child still stood, his face twisted into that eerie grin, holding a basketball and bouncing it slowly. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing through the empty gym. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted outside, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted smile. I hit the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't return to the school the next night. I never went back there again. The ghosts in the fog. Tonight, like every other night, I drove my truck down a desolate rural road, taking a sip of coffee to stay awake. The road stretched ahead, cloaked in a thick fog that clung to my headlights. The stillness was eerie. No cars, no animals, just the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of the radio. I considered stopping to wait, but decided to keep going. Moving felt safer than sitting in the dark. A faint smell wafted in, like something metallic. At first, I thought it was just the engine, but it grew stronger, sour and rotten, mingled with the scent of decaying bone. It was stifling, worse than anything I'd ever smelled. I rolled up the window, but the stench lingered, filling the truck like a living thing. My stomach churned violently, and I pulled over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for fresh air, but the stench clung to me, lingering in the air. Unable to bear it any longer, I began vomiting. Once I was done, I quickly covered my nose as the smell still hung thick in the air. As I straightened up, I noticed movement ahead, a figure limping across the road, slow and deliberate. The figure was a man. He wore a torn white shirt and black trousers, the fabric old and frayed. I froze, watching him cross the road, oblivious to the faint presence of my truck. His head was slightly bowed, his face obscured by the fog. I climbed back into the cab, intending to approach him. As I drove closer, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing more figures emerging from the fog. All dressed in old-fashioned clothing, moved disjointedly. They limped in unison, heads bowed. They didn't seem to notice me or each other, moving toward the darkness on the other side of the road. I kept driving. Then, from the same direction, a smaller figure appeared, a child, maybe in their early teens. The dense fog surrounded him as he stood motionless on the road, head bowed. Uneasy, I thought the boy might need help. I stopped the truck and stepped out once more. I approached him. "Do you need help?" I called, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. The boy didn't respond. Instead, his body remained unnaturally still, his head bowed like a puppet with its strings cut. A heavy silence blanketed the road. I swallowed hard and took another hesitant step forward. Suddenly, the boy's head snapped upward with a jerky motion, the crack of his neck loud enough to echo in the stillness. His face was pale and vacant. I stumbled backward as he tilted his head, as if studying me. Then an impossibly wide mouth opened, a gaping maw that hissed a single word.
"You won't escape!"
Before I could react, he lunged forward, his icy hands clamping around my leg like a vise. He tightened his grip further. I kicked desperately, trying to break free. Pain shot through me as my knee hit the road. I clawed at the ground, panic surging through me. With all my strength, I yanked my leg free and scrambled backward. My hands and knees burned from the sharp gravel, but I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping. The boy stood and started running toward me, his arms flailing and legs bent at unnatural angles. I stumbled toward the truck, with him right behind me. I dove into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock. His scream was deafening, shaking the truck's windows. His grotesque face, with its gaping mouth, pressed against the windshield. His hands slammed against the glass, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. Trembling, I turned the key and slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, throwing him off the hood. His twisted body writhed as he stood back up. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the road, surrounded by other nameless figures emerging from the fog. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the fog growing thicker. They stood motionless, watching as my truck sped into the darkness. The road stretched ahead through thick fog. I couldn't stop thinking about the faceless figures I'd seen before. Days had passed since I escaped the boy in the fog. Their hollow presence, the way they lunged toward me. It felt like they were still out there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for me. But I couldn't turn back. My delivery had to be made, and this was the only road. Then that smell hit me again faintly at first. Metallic, but quickly turning into a stench, sharp and rancid, like rotting meat. My stomach twisted as I tried to breathe through my mouth, but it was no use. Ahead, my dim headlights illuminated an old sign by the roadside. It swayed lightly in the wind, its paint cracked and faded. Danger, though at the time, I had no idea of its significance. My headlights flickered briefly, catching the silhouette of a figure in the distance. I slowed the truck, squinting to see the figure more clearly. It was a man, limping across the road, his form distorted by the fog. I hesitated, unsure whether to stop. Then another figure appeared, and another. All of them moved in the same direction, heads bowed, their movements unnervingly stiff. I continued driving slowly, keeping my distance. The figures kept crossing, oblivious to my truck, disappearing into the fog on the other side. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Just people," I muttered, trying to calm myself. "Just people." Then my tires hit something wet and slippery, causing the truck to swerve. I slammed on the brakes, and then I saw it. A black, wet streak stretched across the asphalt. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing air biting at my skin. The stench hit me, a wave of nausea roiling my stomach. Ahead, the trail led to the carcass of an animal, its body decayed and rotting. Flies buzzed frantically around it, staining the road with wide, dark streaks. I was about to leave, but then something caught my attention farther down the road, shapes moving in the fog. A group of people stood by the roadside. Their movements were strange, unnatural. The next sound that reached me was growling, and perhaps chewing, as if they were gnawing on something. The fog thinned enough for me to see them clearly. I didn't know what they were, but they resembled the things I had seen before, only much more terrifying. Horrifying hollow cavities gaped on their faces and bodies, oozing a black, tar-like fluid. Some of them hunched over another animal carcass, gnawing on its remains with clawed, deformed hands. My gasping breath broke the silence. Then their movements suddenly slowed to a halt. For a moment, I froze, and the others followed suit, all raising their heads in unison. They were looking at me. Then they began running, charging toward me. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their growls morphing into frenzied screams. They were faster than I imagined. I stumbled, fumbling for my keys as I turned back toward the truck. The keys slipped from my hand and fell. I was only a few steps from the truck when something grabbed my leg. I fell hard, hitting the ground. One of them had grabbed my leg. My foot was slick with its slimy grip. In a moment of desperate panic, I twisted and kicked with all my strength to break free. I staggered to my feet and bolted for the truck. I slammed on the gas, speeding away from those grotesque creatures. I didn't stop. My hands ached. The road stretched ahead, silent. In the rearview mirror, all that remained was an empty highway. I swore I would never take that road again. I silently thanked whatever force had kept me alive. Dark intentions at Dunkin' Donut. The fluorescent lights flicker above me as I sit on the edge of a narrow bed. The cold walls, the air thick with dust and time. It's been 2 years, but I remember it all as if it happened yesterday. The Dunkin' Donuts shop, the rain, and Jerry. That's where it all began. I worked the night shift at the Dunkin' Donuts in a quiet suburban town. It was a small place, nestled between an old laundromat and a thrift store. I saved what I could, putting money aside each night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job, and it kept me going. My sister usually stopped by, but tonight she wasn't there to see me. She was sitting by the window with a guy, her eyes red from crying. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was obvious they were arguing. She looked so distressed. He wore an old, worn coat, lingering at the door, watching the place. Tonight, he hesitated at the door, lingering longer than usual. I tried to keep my distance. There was something about him that made my skin crawl. I snapped out of my thoughts when the door creaked open, and Jerry walked in. He was irregular but always so strange. His habit of coming in at exactly 10 p.m. never failed. He shuffled to the counter, but his gaze shifted to my sister, now sitting alone, staring out the window. Jerry leaned in, asking me about her, asking if he could get her number. I clenched my jaw, trying to smile politely, but the sharpness in my voice slipped out. "Leave her alone, Jerry. Just order and go." He chuckled and said, all right, I'll have the usual." He ordered a chocolate donut and hot chocolate, which he always ordered, and went to his usual seat in the corner. I watched him eat, tearing tiny pieces off his donut, his eyes flicking toward me now and then, making me uneasy. My shift ended. It was pouring as I walked home, the streets deserted, but after a few blocks, I started hearing another set of footsteps, echoing mine, stopping when I stopped. I turned around, but no one was there, just the empty sidewalk stretching under the streetlights. I kept walking, faster, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I finally made it back to my apartment. I went into my bedroom, letting the silence envelop me. But then I saw him, Jerry, standing across the street, holding a radio. He just stood there, staring at me, the radio pressed to his ear. He pressed his head to it, then suddenly smashed it against his head with a blank, puzzled expression. Blood gushed from his head. I scrambled around the room for my phone to get help, but when I looked back, he was gone. I sat on my bed, staring out the window into the rainy night. Jerry's face kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I was sick of seeing him every night. And then, a dark thought crept into my mind, and I felt an odd satisfaction as I imagined it unfolding. I needed to teach him a lesson, to make him understand he wasn't welcome. The next night, I returned to the shop, stopping at the back to grab some supplies. I picked up a box of donuts, carefully selecting a chocolate one, just like Jerry's usual order. I pulled a small vial from my pocket, a stimulant strong enough to paralyze him for a while. I injected it into the donut, the liquid vanishing into the soft pastry. I carefully placed the donut back in the box, my heart racing as I imagined Jerry's face when he realized what was happening. I returned home and watched the rain fall outside the window. The donut sat on the dresser, a reminder of the plan forming in my head. As I sat there, an odd sense of peace washed over me. I didn't know where this road would lead, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't have to see Jerry's face staring at me anymore. Wouldn't have to endure his unsettling presence lurking on the edges of my life. The next night, I returned to the counter, watching the quiet stream of customers come and go, my mind racing with the plan I had laid out. The donut box sat in the drawer, hidden away, with one specific donut prepared for Jerry. I spent the whole day thinking about it, rehearsing the moment in my mind, imagining his face when he realized what I had done. I checked the clock. Almost 10 p.m. The door opened, and Jerry walked in, moving with his usual unsettling calm. I noticed a new scar on his forehead, a reminder of his strange behavior the night before. He glanced at the menu, but his focus was entirely on me. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, throwing it directly at my face. I could feel my anger boiling inside from his action. I reached into the drawer and pulled out the box with the special donut inside. I took him to the table, keeping my face as neutral as possible. He accepted it with a smirk. Then I went back to waiting for what I wanted. I stood still, watching Jerry slowly move his hand to the plate and take out the donut I had prepared for him. He slowly picked it up and intended to enjoy it. I felt very satisfied and happy to be able to witness what was about to happen. I chuckled inside, but then suddenly his hand holding the cake stopped. He put it on the plate and looked away. My heart sank with disappointment. Then I saw the door open again. That's my sister. She was smiling, dressed a little more neatly than usual. When she approached the counter, then turned her eyes to Jerry, her face lit up. I stared in disbelief, piecing everything together as she looked over to his desk. Could it be that what I'm thinking right now is true? My sister said, her voice filled with excitement, "Adam, I want you to meet someone," and pointed to the table where Jerry was sitting. My sister went to his table. Then he started to act gallantly. I suddenly remembered that she also liked to eat chocolate cake. Then, with a distorted smile, he brought the cake to his mouth for my sister to eat. I felt like I was collapsing, and instead a surge of panic hit me. I ran to the table and stumbled, screaming in vain, "Stop!" I screamed, my voice cracking with desperation. Panic flooded the room as I knelt beside her, screaming, shaking her, hoping she'd wake up. Jerry knelt down too, his face showing real horror as he tried to help. He pressed down, trying CPR, but it was no use. She was unconscious, her face pale. That's when it hit me, had I misjudged him all along? I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed for an ambulance, my mind reeling as I realized the gravity of what I had done. The ambulance arrived, and I followed as they loaded her into the back, the siren wailing as they sped toward the hospital. The waiting room was cold, sterile, and I sat there, numb, staring at the wall, my mind racing with guilt, fear, and regret. A doctor came out, his face grim. He told me she was alive, but barely. The drug I put in the donut was enough to paralyze her temporarily, but very dangerous. She might not walk again. If there had been more, she wouldn't have survived. Relief washed over me for only a brief moment before I saw the police step into the waiting room, their eyes fixed on me. They approached, and I could feel the weight of what was about to happen. The room was harshly lit, cold, and unwelcoming. They asked me questions, again and again, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them the truth, every detail, from Jerry's strange behavior to the plan I had laid out, unaware of the devastating consequences. The officer listened and told me I was lucky my sister was still alive. But I should not be mistaken. This was premeditated, and I would face the consequences. With the camera evidence and the plots I had schemed, I was now convicted, the weight of my actions bearing down on me as I was led away. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door through the cold prison bars. The world seemed distant, but the memories of that night never left me. I wondered about my sister, hoping she had healed, hoping she had moved on, and maybe, someday, she would forgive me. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting Delivery Trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Echoes from the haunted shop. It all began as a challenge. Every town has one, a haunted location that no one dares to enter after dark. For their city, it was an old fast food restaurant that had closed down years ago after a string of mysterious deaths. Now, it stood there, decaying at the corner of the street. For years, stories surrounded the place. Customers disappeared, strange noises echoed at night, and lights flickered inside despite no power. Some even claimed the place was cursed. The building loomed before them, weeds sprouting through cracks in the sidewalk, and an old, rusty delivery truck sat in a distant corner. The neon sign had long since died, but somehow, even in its decay, it emitted an eerie glow under the moonlight. They approached the door, and James pushed it open without hesitation. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. A foul odor immediately assaulted their noses. A rotten mixture of mold and something much worse, something decaying. But as she stepped inside, Sarah felt a chill seep into her bones. Her eyes darted around, wide with anticipation. Inside, the scene was worse than expected. It looked frozen in time, as if everyone had left one day and never returned. Dust covered the wrapping counter and old trays lay scattered on the floor. Then, a flickering light appeared at the back, something that shouldn't have been on. As there was no power here, they moved toward the kitchen, where most of the rumors originated. They said a corpse had been found here. As they approached the kitchen door, the overhead light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. James gave a nervous smile. The kitchen was a mess. Rusty appliances were caked with grease. The tiled floor was cracked, and dark stains splattered the walls. They began to hear whispering growing louder, coming from the old cold storage room at the back of the kitchen. Sarah stepped closer and peered inside. Something caught her attention, a reflection. At the back of the cold storage room, behind the shelves, was a mirror. The strange thing was they had never seen a mirror inside a cold storage before. And in the reflection were the two of them. But there was another dark shadow standing right behind Sarah and James. She turned around abruptly, but the room was empty. But in the mirror, they could both see her. A woman. She stood just a few feet away, her sunken eyes and skeletal face staring at them hungrily. In fear, they turned to leave, but the cold storage door slammed shut with a deafening noise. Darkness seemed to engulf them. She didn't dare look back, feeling a chilling presence as if she were right there behind her. Sarah fumbled for her phone, desperately seeking light, and when she turned on the flashlight, everything only got worse. In the beam of light, Sarah saw her face. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. It was pale, eyes rolled back, emaciated, and her skin seemed to crack. Her bony fingers brushed against Sarah's skin. And then, suddenly, as quickly as it had started, she vanished. Before she could regain her composure, in the corner of the room, hidden among boxes and discarded trays, something caught Sarah's eye. She stopped, pointing with a trembling finger. It was a woman lying on the floor, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was still decaying. She thought it couldn't be simple. Perhaps it was a murder. There was no time to think anymore. They hurriedly left the place. Sarah trembled. In a panic, she pulled out her phone to call 911. A while later, they arrived to cordon off and investigate the abandoned place. Then they heard an announcement from a detective. The woman they found matched the missing person they were searching for. Her family had reported her missing just 2 days prior. A chill ran down their spines as they heard his words. Realizing they had just encountered the victim of an unsolved case made the atmosphere feel heavy. Returning home, even now in the silence of the room, they sometimes heard whispers. They thought perhaps this wasn't a place to explore. There's always a reason why places like this have rumors, and they often stem from real dangers. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most windows were dark. Rena was standing outside, staring up at the second floor. Her floor. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet, until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and taking out the trash usually only took a few minutes. But tonight, she felt as though someone was watching her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hallway, he was there. Arthur was standing by his door, looking as though he had been waiting for her. He always found excuses to talk and stand uncomfortably close to Rena. She lowered her head, quickly murmured a greeting, and walked toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. Goosebumps rose on Rena's skin. Something felt different tonight, making her more uneasy than before. Rena entered her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to lie in bed and watch TV. It was late, and she was tired, but she wasn't ready to sleep yet. As she walked past the broom closet, she heard a faint sound, a soft rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet door handle. She hesitated. Then she pulled the door open. Arthur was in there, inside her storage closet. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He was just there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She gasped, stumbling backward, unable to believe what she was seeing. She ran into her bedroom, slamming the door shut. But she didn't have time to lock it. The door burst open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild and unhinged. She dashed toward the bathroom, the only place left to hide. She slammed the door shut just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena's back pressed against the cold bathroom wall. Her breaths came in quick gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was the only thing separating her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks. His sickening grin etched deeply into her mind. Thankfully, she had her phone. She clutched it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, strangled by the fear gripping her. Arthur pounded on the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it couldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. She didn't know if he had left. Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience had run out. His hand hovered over the doorknob. He knew she was cornered, with nowhere to escape. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming knife. His fingers tightened around the handle. Nightmare Neighbor. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed away, nearly pressing herself against the wall. She screamed at him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a bruising grip. Rena struggled to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it against the wall. Her phone slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor. Arthur's face was only inches from hers as he hissed threats, blaming her for always ignoring him when they crossed paths in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, squeezing tighter. His knife swiped through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain tore through her skin, leaving her injured and bleeding. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder as the police rushed toward the apartment building. The flashing lights reflected on the window, like a beacon of hope in the stifling darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her neck. Her free hand flailed, fumbling along the counter by the sink and the shelves, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it against Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered backward, momentarily dazed. Arthur stumbled, and the knife slipped from his grip, falling to the floor. Rena didn't wait. She bolted for the door, clutching her bleeding arm. She fled the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Blood streamed down his face from where the glass bottle had struck him. Enraged, he grabbed the knife from the floor and charged toward her. The police stormed the apartment complex. They knew they had to act fast. Rena reached the living room, but her legs gave out, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence closing in, the knife still in his hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight in them gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, struggling to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled,
"There's nowhere left to run, girl."
Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police stormed into the apartment, cutting through the tension. Arthur stubbornly held on to her, refusing to let her go. Seizing the opportunity, Rena stomped on his foot, making him cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm, but the nightmare was over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of the car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, the police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift, it was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache. mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, the house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him. Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button, just as my friend and I had planned beforehand. He quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing. Strange man in the cemetery. This summer, my family decided to go camping in a suburban village, a place where every corner seemed to hold a mysterious story. The locals were always whispering, especially about the nearby forest. But what intrigued me the most was the cemetery within the forest. No one had ever gone there after dark. We were not allowed to go there either. My cousin had the idea to play hide and seek at night. He liked to break boundaries, challenging all of us to venture into the forbidden forest. I went with my younger sister, who was only 10 at the time, and my cousin. He confidently decided to help us hide. I should have known it was a bad idea the moment he mentioned the cemetery. We crept through the forest, the leaves crunching underfoot. The closer we got to the cemetery, the colder the air became. Even the stray dogs that had been barking earlier were now completely silent, a sense of fear and unease flooded over me. My little sister held my hand tightly. But then, in the eerie silence, a sound pierced the air, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the unmistakable sound of digging. Out of the darkness, we saw him, a disheveled old man in filthy clothes, hunched over a grave. He was digging with his bare hands, muttering something incomprehensible. My eyes followed his hand. I saw something pale, like a stiff hand, sticking out of the freshly dug earth. None of us dared to move for a moment. My cousin was the first to act. He slowly pulled us back, whispering that we had to leave, that we needed to move silently. The man bent down again, this time pulling away more earth, revealing more of an arm, a foot, a body. Then he dragged out several small plastic bags and laid them on the ground. My sister trembled, and we were slowly sneaking away. Then I accidentally stepped on a branch. My heart skipped a beat, knowing that sound might give us away. He slowly raised his head, turned to us, and said,
You shouldn't be here.
Then he stared at us and gave a slow, creepy smile, as if he had lost his mind. The man laughed maniacally, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. Then he took a step forward, his bare feet dragging across the ground.
You kids want to know what's down here?
Before I could react, my cousin scooped up my sister, pulling her into his arms. The man's voice taunted us, as if daring us.
See what they're hiding in the ground.
I stumbled, frozen. My cousin yanked on my arm, snapping me back to reality. He yelled, "Run!" and we bolted away from the cemetery. I ran as if my life depended on it. I could hear him behind us, his feet scraping on the gravel, his wheezing breath growing closer. I didn't dare stop. My cousin pulled us forward, his grip tight, until we reached the cemetery gate. We burst through the gate. For some reason, the man had stopped. He was no longer chasing us. He didn't follow, just stood there, watching. Then, as if he had never been there, he turned around and disappeared into the darkness of the cemetery. We returned to the campsite. No one said a word or mentioned what had happened. The next day, we found out that the old man had been arrested by the police. He was a deranged criminal who had been desecrating graves to smuggle drugs across the border. That night, we felt truly lucky. I still wonder what would have happened if he had been younger, stronger, faster. We never went near that forest again and reminded ourselves never to ignore warnings and restrictions again. The troublemaker at Starbucks. Lai had just graduated from college and found a temporary job, which left her struggling to find a place to live. Lai rented a small apartment near a Starbucks where she worked as a barista. Starbucks was a hangout spot for local musicians and artists, the kind of crowd who knew their coffee. It stayed open until midnight, sometimes even later on weekends. Lai worked the night shift, a shift most employees weren't fond of. The pay was decent, though not great, but the shifts were quiet. However, there was always something unsettling about the empty cafe late at night, especially toward closing time. She spent most of her time cleaning and making coffee to keep herself busy. Nick, a friend of Lai's, would sometimes drop by to keep her company. He knew everyone who worked there. But one summer night, everything changed. Nick wasn't there that evening. He didn't show up because he was attending a friend's wedding, leaving Lai to face the night shift alone. By midnight, she had made only $10 in tips, and the store was almost entirely empty. But she felt grateful that she didn't have to deal with any difficult customers. She went to the back room to fill the mop bucket and started cleaning the floor. The silence was peaceful, but something felt off. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow pass by the front window. Lai glanced up, but no one was there. She called out, asking if anyone was there, thinking a customer had come in through the back door, but there was no response. After a moment of hesitation, she shrugged, thinking she had imagined it. and went back to cleaning behind the counter. Suddenly, she heard the bathroom door open. Lai's heart started pounding, and she felt uneasy. She hadn't seen anyone come in, and the store had been completely empty just minutes before. To her surprise, Nick walked out of the bathroom. A wave of relief washed over her, and she smiled, calling out,
"Nick, what are you doing here?"
He grinned back at her, saying he had just dropped by after the wedding, but something in his expression had changed. His usual friendly demeanor had turned into something unsettling. She gave an awkward smile, brushing off the strange feeling, and offered him a drink. As she started making an espresso, Lai glanced at him. He was staring at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. Lai tried to act normal and asked him what he was up to. Nick didn't respond. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a USB drive. His smile widened as he tossed it onto the counter. She stared at it, confused, asking what it was. Nick leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. He said he had recorded something Lai wouldn't want anyone else to see. She didn't understand what he was talking about. He stood up straight, crossing his arms. Nick threatened her about some private conversations she had with her boss. Panic started to rise in her, and she yelled that he was lying. Nick shook his head, his smile never fading. Her mind raced, trying to figure out if he was lying, but the confidence in his voice made it clear that he wasn't. He chuckled softly, stepping closer. He spoke to Lai with crude words. He had initially planned to blackmail her, but now he didn't need to, and he thought it was time for Lai to show some appreciation for all the nights he'd kept her company. A nauseating feeling rose in Lai's throat as she realized what he was implying. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, screaming that he was insane and that she hadn't done anything. Nick's smile turned sinister. Her hands trembled, barely able to breathe as she tried to figure out how to escape. The store was closed, and the doors were locked. She was alone with him, and he was moving in, ready to corner her. She backed away and pleaded with him. His expression darkened, saying he had spent too much time helping without getting anything in return. He reached behind his back and pulled out a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. She glanced around the room, desperately searching for a way to escape. Her eyes landed on the espresso machine, and an idea formed in her mind. Lai tried to stall him and suggested making him a cup of coffee first. Nick raised an eyebrow but didn't object. She hurried behind the counter, her hands trembling as she poured an espresso. Her heart raced as she reached for the panini press. Without warning, Lai grabbed it and swung it at Nick's head with all her strength. The metal struck the side of his skull, and he staggered back, dropping the knife. Blood trickled down his face, and he let out a groan of pain. But the blow wasn't enough to bring him down. She needed to act fast. Lai ran around the counter, her eyes fixed on Nick as he wiped the blood from his face and started moving toward her. She frantically scanned the room for another weapon or an escape. Nick moved slowly, deliberately, as if he knew Lai had nowhere to run. His smile had vanished, replaced by a grim expression. She backed up toward the rear of the cafe, her mind racing to come up with a plan. The mop bucket was still near the back door. If only she could reach it. With trembling hands, she lunged for the mop bucket, grabbed the metal handle, and swung it at him. Nick dodged the first blow, but she swung again, striking him in the ribs. He groaned in pain, stumbling backward. She didn't stop. She swung again, this time aiming for his legs. It sent Nick crashing to the ground with a pained yell, clutching his knee. She seized the opportunity and ran for the back door. Lai fumbled with the lock as Nick struggled to get up. She finally managed to open the door and dashed out into the alley behind the store. She kept running, too afraid to look back as she heard Nick's footsteps behind her. He was limping, but he was still chasing her. Lai rounded a corner and spotted a large metal dumpster near the end of the alley. She crouched behind it, holding her breath. Her heart was pounding so fast it felt like it might burst out of her chest. From her hiding spot, she heard Nick stumble into the alley. His breathing was heavy, labored from the pain, and then his bitter voice called out, asking where she was, saying it wasn't over yet. Like covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stay as silent as possible, not daring to move. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound, the wail of sirens in the distance. Maybe someone had heard the commotion and called the police. Nick began limping back toward the Starbucks, his footsteps growing fainter as he disappeared into the night. Her legs were shaking so much, she could barely stand. She knew she had to leave before he came back. As she stumbled onto the street, she saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. I felt a wave of relief and waved for help. A short time later, Lai was brought to the interrogation room at the police station. The officers came in and told her that Nick had been arrested. He had been hiding in the cafe, trying to erase the security footage. The relief was immense. It was finally over. Nick had been arrested, and the evidence against him was undeniable. He would be charged with multiple crimes, including assault and attempted blackmail. The nightmare was over, and Nick would pay for everything he had done. Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. "He's coming." We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. Killer in the Rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house. A small, flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and it called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside, they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet. But they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Strange clown in the parking lot. It was a chilly October evening in 2016, just a few weeks before Halloween. My friends, Jake and Sarah, and I decided to catch a late-night movie at the local theater. After the movie, which ended around midnight, we lingered in the parking lot, chatting and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The parking lot was mostly empty, illuminated by a few dim streetlights, creating long shadows that danced eerily around us. As we laughed about the horror movie we had just seen, Jake suddenly fell silent, staring behind us. We turned to see a clown standing by an old, beat-up car at the edge of the parking lot. He was dressed in a dirty, oversized clown suit with a red wig and smeared white face paint. Unlike the clowns at birthday parties, this one had a sinister air about him, his smile too wide and his eyes too dark. At first, we thought it was a prank. After all, clown sightings had become a bizarre trend that year. But as he started walking towards us, the playful notion quickly vanished. His movements were slow and deliberate, and in his gloved hand, he held a balloon that bobbed menacingly with each step. Nervously, we decided to head to Jake's car, which was parked a short distance away. We tried to act casual, but our pace quickened with each step. The clown followed, maintaining a steady, unnerving pace. My heart pounded as we reached the car and scrambled inside. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Just as we locked the doors, the clown reached the car. He leaned against the driver's side window, his face inches away from Jake's. He pressed the balloon against the glass and slowly dragged his finger down the window, leaving a streak in the condensation. We could see his eyes clearly now, cold and calculating. He tapped on the glass, the sound echoing in the silent parking lot. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do next. The clown then moved to the front of the car, standing directly in the headlights. He reached into his oversized pocket and pulled out a long, jagged knife. The sight of the blade sent a fresh wave of panic through us. Jake finally snapped out of his shock and started the car. The engine roared to life, and the clown took a step back, still smiling that unsettling smile. We peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, and didn't stop until we were miles away, parked in front of a 24-hour diner. We sat in the car, catching our breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. We debated calling the police, but without any real harm done, we doubted they'd take us seriously. In the end, we decided to keep the story to ourselves, not wanting to relive the terrifying encounter. To this day, the image of that clown and his menacing smile haunts us. We often wonder what his intentions were and shudder at the thought of what might have happened if we hadn't reached the car in time. The experience left a lasting impression, a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest encounters are the ones that seem to step straight out of a nightmare. The creepy secret of the cheap motel. On our anniversary, we had a memorable time in every sense at an old suburban area. The bus ride took forever, and before we knew it, the sun was setting. Since we traveled by bus, it took more time, and soon it was evening. I didn't realize it was festival season there, so it was quite expensive and crowded. We found a very cheap place to stay, although it was a bit hard to find. I think the problem was that we entered any nearby place without considering the location. We prepared a simple dinner, shared stories, and then picked a movie to watch together. Suddenly, Min told me she started feeling a bit tired and dizzy, probably exhausted from the whole day. We decided to go to bed early to be ready for our plans the next day. I quickly fell asleep. However, Min found herself tossing and turning, unable to find a comfortable position and mumbling something softly. When she finally started to drift off, she told me she felt a strange sensation taking over her. Suddenly, my eyes opened for no reason. I usually sleep deeply and rarely wake up in the middle of the night unless someone shakes me awake. But my girlfriend, who was sleeping next to me, turned over, and I woke up due to her movement. Around midnight, Min started tossing and turning in her sleep. Her face was contorted with discomfort, and she began sweating profusely. Her skin was pale and clammy, and her breathing became strange and irregular. I opened my eyes slightly and saw my girlfriend get up and walk to the bathroom. Her movements were stiff, almost puppet-like, as if an invisible force was guiding her. At that moment, I saw a dark shadow following her. It wasn't her shadow because it had no hair on its head. Instead, it was a black figure with hands and feet moving independently, not matching her movements. It had no eyes, nose, or mouth, but it resembled a human figure. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena without scientific evidence, but I definitely thought something was wrong. When I fully woke up, I jumped out of bed and ran to the bathroom where my girlfriend had gone. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then, I heard the laughter of a middle-aged man from inside. I remember it clearly because I wasn't drunk and was definitely alert. Slowly turning the locked doorknob, I shouted my girlfriend's name. "Open the door." I stood outside the bathroom, anxiety engulfing me. But there was no sound from inside, and the door remained closed. I still can't recall if the next part was a dream or reality. The laughter grew louder and more terrifying. I hesitated but finally mustered the courage to open the door, only to find the bathroom empty. I thought long and hard about what had happened and went back to bed to try and collect myself. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and I felt a chilling sensation run down my spine. I nearly fainted when I saw it. My girlfriend was standing on the bed, staring at me with wide eyes as if possessed by something, then gave me a terrifying smile. I had been dating her for nearly 2 years, but had never seen such a horrifying smile before. Her eyes, once warm and loving, now held a chilling emptiness. She laughed again, the sound echoing through the room, sending shivers down my spine. I grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard, but she just fell back into sleep. I couldn't sleep that night and waited until morning with my eyes wide open. Min woke up and advanced towards me, her laughter becoming louder and more hysterical. I recoiled, my mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. The previously cozy bedroom had transformed into a nightmarish enclosure. I tried to reach Min, hoping to pull her out of whatever trance she was in. She went silent, her body collapsing to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. I immediately took her to the hospital because she had fainted, feeling less afraid in the daylight despite not believing much in the supernatural. I began to clean up and quickly got out of the rental. As we left the rental, I asked her if she remembered anything from the previous night, but she seemed unaware of what had happened. I didn't tell her anything because I thought she would be scared if I detailed the events. But now, after 10 years, I suddenly recalled the incident and started researching the rental. It turns out that there had been several murders and suicides there over the past few decades. The media didn't directly mention the name of the place, but I'm certain it's the right one after. Reading some reviews about the accommodation. The crazy mother on campus. Exam season had arrived, and normally our school library would close, but because of the exams, the school decided to keep it open until midnight. My house is not far from the school, so instead of studying at home, I prefer to study in the quiet and peaceful library. That day, I left home at 6 o'clock, engrossed in my studies, and didn't realize that it was already 10 p.m. I had never stayed this late before. The ticking clock was loud, each second echoing in the emptiness, signaling that it was nearly midnight. Strangely, there were hardly any students studying at that hour. It was absolute silence. I finished my work and headed home. The library is at the end of the hallway, so as usual, I walked down the long, dark corridor of the school. But today, I felt an unusual chill in the air. It was empty and the silence was suffocating. I walked through the hallway and quickly approached the exit. I walked fast, the sound of my footsteps echoing ominously. The once familiar campus now felt strange and frightening. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The path narrowed as I entered the school garden, the lights becoming fewer. A sudden loud snap of a branch made me stop dead in my tracks. I spun around, heart racing, but saw only shadows. Exhausted and hungry, I could barely walk properly. I kept my eyes on the ground as I walked. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a woman walking with a strange, crippled gait. Her legs seemed twisted, making it difficult for her to walk. She moved like a zombie. Now I was close enough to see her clearly. Her clothes were torn and filthy, her hair hanging in tangled clumps around her ghostly pale face. My heart pounded in my chest as the woman limped toward me, her eyes staring as if she wanted to pounce on me. I backed away, fear enveloping me. The uneven footsteps of the woman grew louder, echoing in the empty night. She pursued me relentlessly. I ran aimlessly until I reached the school parking lot, desperately searching for a place to hide. The parking lot was eerily empty. I hid behind a car, my breath coming in ragged gasps from the exhausting chase. But she did not tire. She searched for me with a crazed determination. From my hiding spot, I saw the woman moving past the cars, her head turning from side to side, searching. I felt truly terrified and breathless. The woman stopped near my hiding place. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound, and prayed she wouldn't see me. Thankfully, she just stood there, scouting the area, and then turned and continued moving. Seizing the opportunity, I bolted from my hiding spot, running towards the dormitory. The lights of the building were a beacon of hope, but the woman's footsteps grew louder behind me. I didn't care about anything else. I just ran, fearing for my life. I reached the dormitory entrance, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keypad. I could hear the woman's labored breathing right behind me. Finally, the door clicked open, and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. I looked through the glass, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. The campus was dark and silent. I collapsed onto my bed, my mind racing with the terror of what had just happened. The image of the woman's pale, haunting face was etched into my memory. The next morning, I was determined to find out more about what I had experienced. I asked the groundskeeper who tended to the school's garden. He looked quite old, so I thought he might know something. I asked him, and he said that in 1998, there was a 32-year-old woman who had a 20-year-old daughter who also attended this school. One day, while playing with her friends, the daughter mysteriously had an accident on the school grounds and died. The mother couldn't bear the thought that her daughter might have been bullied or something terrible had happened to her that she didn't know about. Losing her daughter drove her mad, and she would appear and disappear erratically. I decided I would never walk alone on the school grounds again. For the sake of my safety, the danger was too real and could strike at any moment. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again, the sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nikki spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nikki stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nikki rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear.